Hi, sorry.
Wake up.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for coming to the Sculpting Words Art of the Edit Forum. My name is Julia Tan. I'm your moderator for tonight. I'm actually quite surprised by the turnout. To be honest, I didn't think that so many would be interested in what we do. Because, let's face it, editors aren't the sexiest of creatures. We don't... We don't get to go on book tours, we don't have fan clubs, we don't have groupies. Matter of fact, name one famous editor. Apart from the Gareth. Right? Didn't think so. I mean, no kid grew up saying that they wanted to be an editor. It's always pilot, astronaut, doctor, whatever, but editor is not really up there on the list. Yes, writer, of course, but I mean, I never said I want to be an editor when I grew up. Not really.
Have you grown up?
Yet, editing is very much a crucial part of writing, although most times the relationship between editor and writer is more often than not tumultuous. Nabokov referred to editors as pompous, avuncular brutes. T.S. Eliot called us field writers. I can only imagine what I'm being called behind my back. Something along the lines of Stalin, perhaps, especially by those who send 3,000 words, and it gets cut down to 1/3 of that size, because, be concise, people. I don't need 5 different ways of describing a tree. It's got leaves, it's got a trunk, it's got roots, that's it. That's enough for me. Anything else is redundant. Of course, for most writers, each word was born of a magical spark in their heads, of cerebral connections creating captivating clauses.
Oh, really?
Editors see things differently, though. I'd like to think that we see through these writers, that the greatness coming from their heads is sometimes actually just hot air through their derriere. Because a good writer should, at the same time, be a good editor. If you don't edit yourself, then you have failed as a writer worth your salt. Today we have here Gareth Richards and Helena Dodge-Wan of Impress Creative and Editorial, who both have an impressive list of works that they have edited. Gareth, apart from keeping, of course, is one of my gurus. He is a most patient teacher, but absolutely ruthless when it comes to his craft. Sorry, let me just turn the page. My shaking hands. I'm usually behind a screen. I'm not usually up here. I sincerely hope that everyone here learns a thing or three from these two on, well, sculpting other people's prose. Ki Beng, my own editor for the past 5 years, is the editor of Penang Monthly. I look forward to hearing him present on the role of the editor as a test reader, bridging between writers and authors, and dealing with non-native speakers, himself being a translator on top of being an editor. The similarities between these two roles would be interesting to explore. And then we have Minh Bui Jones, founding editor of the Mekong Review, and also founding editor of the Diplomat and American Review. If you haven't yet picked up a copy of the Mekong, the best of compilation is on sale here. Pick one up and you'll get what I mean. The way Min curates the Mekong is as though he had taken one of his ribs and breathed life into those crisp yellow pages. Raymond Carver, an American short story writer and poet, said this of his editor, Gordon Lish: "If I have any standing or reputation or credibility in this world, I owe it to you. Our names might not be on bylines or the spines of books, but I take great pride in polishing diamonds from the rough. I'm also up for free dinner." Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, again, for taking the time to come and find out what happens behind the pages. I present to you our first speaker, Ki Beng.
Just sit and discuss. Yeah, hi everyone. Thank you, Julia. Well, thanks for letting me go first. I never, I've never been to editing school or anything like that. And I think why we decided to have the three speakers here today, I think we actually edit very different things. And I think the journey to becoming an editor was quite a bit for all three of us. For one thing, today is Sunday evening, which is the end of our week, I think, isn't it? And then it starts again tomorrow, right? One thing about being an editor is that you lose the difference between a working day or a weekend. Well, actually, you edit when when you have free time, then you edit in a way. Now I don't have a proper speech. I'll just reflect on my own experience in becoming an editor and the editing work I've done the last 10 years or so. I think I came from being a writer first, so I did a lot of writing before I entered into editing. And it also came with age in that I was working in Singapore then, and I decided that the younger researchers under me, they actually needed to up their game a bit. And actually, I did realize that the best way to do that is for someone to actually edit their work. And since I was in a way their boss, so I felt it was my job to do that because I didn't want articles going out that were substandard, if you put it that way. Not in content as such, but in how the presentation is done. And that turned out to be quite a good solution. It's very good to edit people when you're their boss, right? They tend to agree with you. You notice that very clearly when you suddenly edit someone who isn't under you, and then and who wouldn't accept most of his changes. But the fact is that I feel that I'm working in a post-colonial context, so that most of our writers are not native speakers or native writers of English, and that configures everything really to my mind. I think the three of us edit different things in different formats. I edit largely academic stuff. I think Gareth does that as well. But mine are usually rather short pieces, so they're journal articles or even shorter. And so what you want out of that is quite different from if you're editing a book. Now back to the post-colonial bit. I do find that writers from the region tend to fall for cliches, which is fine, except that they don't know it themselves. So you have, and there's nothing that turns a reader off more than 2 cliches in a row, perhaps, and then you're off to some other article. So it sort of becomes the editor's job, an editor in my position anyway, to watch out for that. You're not really looking for mistakes in the grammar. You're actually looking for flow. You're trying to keep the reader interested. So I would think that my job as editor has largely been not a proofreader, a test reader, I think. So that if I don't like what I read, nobody else probably will. I have to take on that role, right? And so if I read a sentence and I don't get it at first reading, then that's not on. And so you go in and you change it. And I found that doing editorial articles for think tanks, you have the time factor, unlike perhaps university editing that maybe you have more time to correct and whatnot. But not in think tanks. Things have to come out very quickly. And so you learn very quickly to, when you find that something is a bit dubious, you get dictatorial. You just cut the thing out, or you just change it so that it makes sense to you. And then when it's all done, you send it back to the author and say, this is the final, are you okay with it? And 99 out of 100 times they say yes. It's quite strange. Which leads me to the conclusion that it helps that an editor is quite a mature person in age and experience, because he has a sense of what the usual mistakes are. But really, I think 8 out of 10 times, the mistakes are not unique. They're not unique. They're just mistakes that we as post-colonial societies actually make. Not only because English is not our native tongue, but the English that we learn in school is also limited in a lot of ways. And I think it's the job of the editor to actually, in a way, modernize and give it some air, you know, and things like that, I think. So what is an editor? I won't say he's an unsung hero. I think he's an unsung laborer, if you like, because it's very tough work. It's very, yeah, you go through word by word, you know, and sometimes you have to make decisions about whether a text is better in the present tense or in the past tense, especially when editing a magazine, for example. I tend to find that for magazine articles, if you can, you make it present tense, right? So that the reader feels that he's very close to the point when things happened. In academia, of course, you tend to have past tense, and you reference the article to death. Magazines don't have to, so that's good. And even think tank articles avoid that as well. We don't reference all that much. You just get straight to the point. We have to always keep an eye on the changing habits of the reader too, I suppose. Over the few years I've been in charge of certain publications, I noticed that I automatically start changing how I give headings. Now, headings is very much a part of, or titles, very much a part of editing as well. I noticed that for a lot of think tank articles, I'm starting to have headings that are almost like a sentence. I think in the beginning when we did the Penang Monthly, we would have the standard way. You would have a short heading, as catchy as possible, and then you have a stand first that explains that catchy heading that didn't say very much. That's why you needed a stand first. Now, because of how we relate to the internet and to WhatsApp and whatever, I find that I'm making headings sound like half a stand first. So instead of a snappy title, you have a longer one, but that tells the reader what the article is about. Because you can't expect the reader anymore to like the snappy title that doesn't say exactly what the article is, and then expect him to actually read the article. He probably wouldn't, you know. So the compromise is to have a longer title. That's one change I noticed in myself anyway. Now in academia and in think tank work, very often you're editing for your peers, right? For competitors. And what I said earlier, if you're the boss of these authors, then it becomes easier. It is sad to say quite true. I noticed that after I left my old institution, they couldn't find anyone to take my place because there was no one my age, right? It's an important point because they tend to be, the writers tend to be in mid-career, 50, 45, most of them, and openly or covertly competing with each other. So for editing takes a lot of work. So if I'm going to edit my competitor and make him look really good and he gets all the credit and I've wasted a week or whatever of my precious time to make him look good and he gets the increment, not me. So you can see that it was very difficult for this institution I mentioned to actually get someone to edit people their own age. It is a problem in certain contexts. Yeah. So that's an advantage if you can find someone who's no longer competing with the others. And an editor tends to be a generalist, I suppose, but that's saying too little, really. I think a good editor in the end becomes, even if he didn't start out that way, he soon becomes quite a broad generalist, quite deep because he can't read things too superficially. So it's a great learning process, I think. Part of the reason I still do a lot of editing is that it forces me to read things that I otherwise would just skip, right? And in my line of work, I actually should keep up to date with all the boring articles being written everywhere. And making that a job does help. So you have to keep in touch. I'm sure it affects your writing and whatnot. You tend to be a slightly bland because you've been reading bland things a lot. Yeah, but I won't. I'm sure we're going to overlap in the subjects we're going to talk about. I'll just end with again the localisms. It's always a problem, especially for magazine articles. Not so much for academic ones. For magazine articles to keep the localisms alive and yet not allow them to be too cliche-like, right? So I think it's good for all three of us here that we edit Southeast Asian stuff, and we are very much at home in Southeast Asia, and we know the quirks, the lingual quirks that populations in Southeast Asia probably have in common. Yeah. One thing about correcting, editing, and looking at the grammar, I tend to think in the end it's not the grammar. The grammar is the easy part. Correcting grammar is easy. It's the flow. It's the music that you have to keep. And if it's I think an editor after a while becomes a musician. Yeah. You have to. Suddenly you find that you can use the word "and," in another place you should just drop the "and" and put a comma or whatever. So that sense of flow, I think, is what in the end makes the article. I'm sure Gareth agrees. He's shaking his head. I think I'll stop there, and we could discuss later.
It's my turn. Oh. Hello.
Hello.
I started editing my first magazine in 1995, and I came to it. It's rather a dubious beginning because I took the job as editor because I was in love with a woman who was working there, and I really wanted her. She's now my wife, so it was successful.
What better reason?
And it was accidental, but I learned to love it and in the first decade, when I was starting out as an editor, I committed every single error that you could possibly commit, and that's how, as an editor or as anything really, you learn from your mistakes. And I am a product of many errors, and one of the great benefits of having worked for such a long time is that you become far efficient, a lot efficient at what you do. One of the mistakes I committed a lot when I was young was that I over-edited, I over-commissioned, and then, especially when you're doing a physical magazine, there's space constraints, and so there would be only room for, say, 20 articles, but I would go and commission 30 articles. And there was always a hope that, 5 or 10 of them would never turn up. But there was always a time when they all delivered. and it was all topical, and you didn't know what to do. And there was nothing more excruciating than sending that apology to the writer saying, I really stuffed up, I'm really sorry. Can't publish it because there's no room. And that's one of the things I think is, these are practical things you learn as an editor. And the other thing you also learn is that it is incredibly hard when you are editing the work of a famous author. It really is. I prefer to work with unknown writers most of the time, because there is the expectation that their copies are perfect. You can't touch their work, and obviously as an editor, you have your personal reasons why you think this should be done in a different way, should be structured in this way, or it's too long or too short, and you ask them to rewrite it, and oftentimes they don't. In the current issue of them, and one of the things I've learnt to do is to treat them all equally. In the last issue of the magazine, the November issue, I didn't have any trouble killing an article by Simon Winchester. He submitted a 3,000-word review, and I just didn't think it was very good, and so I told him to take it elsewhere. and that's one thing you learn as an editor, is you take a lot of confidence in your own work. You learn to trust your judgments, and so and of course it all comes down to personal taste and so on. My background is that of a journalist. But prior to I started in television, I was a producer, so I was always behind the scenes, and I was always comfortable behind the scenes. I don't like being in front of all of you guys, and I don't feel very comfortable with that. And when I was working as a journalist, I never felt comfortable having seen my byline. I always enjoyed working behind the scenes, so working as an editor suits me really well. And I must say, I also love the social aspect of being an editor. I just love it to death. Working with writers, with artists, and with photographers, it's just a great joy. I just love talking to them and discussing their essay, and it's always the best essays have always come when you're having a beer or coffee and just chatting away, and then an hour later a beautiful idea would come. Yeah, it just comes out of nowhere, and that's how I've missed that since we returned to Sydney. The Mekong Review was started in Phnom Penh, Cambodia, in October 2015, and I love working there because most of the writers were based there. And there's one street in Phnom Penh, Street 240, where you find all the journalists and writers, because there's just so many pubs there. They would just all be in and out. You bump into any person there, he or she would be a writer. And you can go down there on any given day, and you can commission half the magazine there. It's fantastic. And I miss that, working from Sydney. I feel quite isolated, not only because it's, Australia is a long way from Southeast Asia, and you don't feel the atmosphere of being here. Everything is in your face, the politics, the culture, the food, the urban issues, traffic, pollution, or just the joy of the people living. You miss that, and you can't get that from reading. You have to be there and smell it and eat it. And so I miss that a lot. And I wonder sometimes whether I'm conscious of, I'm looking out for signs when I really have lost it because I've been away for too long, whether I'm out of touch with the region. And I think when I feel that moment has come, that's when I would probably step back and let someone else who live here take over, because you do need to live in the region, I think, to write about the region and to edit a magazine on the region. Sorry, it's a bit of a ramble. There's not much of a structure to my talk.
And guess what? We actually prepared for tonight. My partner in the new venture, who's sitting here in the front row, Bettina Chua, she has a mantra, and the mantra speaks of preparation, preparation, preparation. So that when you actually come to perform, it all looks so easeful, it all looks so spontaneous. But you know the best jokes are really, really prepared a long time in advance. My name's Gareth Richards.
I'm Helena.
And we're actually going to offer a presentation. There'll be some slides. And after Min's fairly general remarks about what a commissioning editor does, and I thought, Ki-Beng, you were beginning to look at some of the detail of what we do here and there, the nitty-gritty. We're going to go to the coalface. We're actually going to tell you what it is that we do. A couple of statements of interest at the beginning. I have been edited by Julia Tan, I have been edited by Ki-Beng, and I have been edited by Minh Bui Jones. No hard feelings, guys, no hard feelings. Conversely, I have also edited Ki-Beng, and I've at least proofread, haven't we proofread? We have proofread Mekong Review, and especially the best of Mekong Review. Somebody said I look much older since they last saw me, which was about a month ago. What's happened in between is that we sent best of Mekong Review to bed, and I aged 10 years. You owe me. So I'm going to give the introduction, and Helena's going to take us mainly through the nitty-gritty of what we do. But I do want to say this at the beginning. One of the things I'm very passionate about is actually the training of a younger cohort of Malaysian editors. It's something we lack. You know, for every wannabe graphic designer, come book designer, for every 50 of those, there's probably one nerd like Julia Tan who actually wants to edit words, who actually wants to be a sculptor of words. But we are the sexiest beasts on the block, believe me. Can't you tell? And I'm really happy to be doing this presentation with Helena, who I think is one of that cohort of younger editors who will finally allow me to actually do what I'm put on this earth to do, which is to sit next to Bettina and actually do all the programming for Hikayat, and I can leave all the editing in her very capable hands. That's one thing. The second thing, I'm also a writer. I never edit my own writing. That's just an iron law. If there's an iron law, yeah, there's an iron law. Never edit your own writing. And I have two very ruthless editors, far more ruthless than these two teddy bears here at the back. Third thing I want to say is we hate writers. Or at least most of them. The easiest two books that I've ever had the privilege of editing, there was something common between the two writers. One of them was Manika Soti Saravanamutu. Don't say that when you've had a gin and tonic. Manika Soti Saravanamutu, father of somebody who you all know, Johan Saravanamutu. I think I'm the family retainer. I've edited for the grandfather, Manika Soti. I've edited for the father, Johan. I've edited for the mother, Mazna, and now the son, Adil. The daughter's 3 years old. I said I can retire when I've got a full hand, all five of them. And the other person who was very, very easy to work with, it was Donna Amoroso. I know this is a bit dark. They were both dead when we edited their books, so there were no trouble whatsoever. But writers can be bastards, and I'm going to explain to you why we have this view of writers. And particularly, I have to say, Malaysian writers, and particularly Malaysian writers of a certain ilk, of a certain status. I love this lady in the second row. She's busy taking notes. Am I going to be done for sedition, or this is Malaysia Baru? I mean, please, don't. So let's start with the first slide. I'll talk to the first slide, and then I'm going to hand over to Helena. Thank you very much. So, the introduction. Let's bring it on. I set up. I'm a former academic. I taught at Manchester University, University of the Philippines, University of Malaya, and then don't hold this against me, you people of Malaysia Baru. I worked for 4 years in Putrajaya in an outfit called Jabatan Peguam Negara. I did, 4 years, yes. You want to know about the inside story of Al Tantoya? Come and buy me a gin and tonic. If you want to know about Sodomy 2, or Sodomy 3, or whichever one it is, come and talk to me about it. 4 years there. And I decided in 2010, not long after Najib came to power, that I'd done my time in the Gulag, and I set up Impress Creative and Editorial. We offer a comprehensive editorial service, please, hello, including translation, and that's maybe something we can touch on. Slow down. Editing you. Including translation work, which of course you may think we only work in English. That's actually not true. I mean, we also do editorial work around Malay titles, sometimes translation from one of the languages to another. We have one of the foremost editors, translators in that regard here. We've also done bilingual books that are Mandarin and English. None yet the other side of the triangle, none yet that we've worked on are Malay Mandarin or Malay Chinese. That's an omission. And Impress, I'm going to only concentrate, as Ki Beng said, on the academic side. So here are some of the clients that we have been working for recently. So they include NUS Press. In fact, we just finished a major book for them recently. UN Press, terrible to work with, really bad to work with. UKM Press, they're okay. I mean, we'll talk about UKM problems later. Then some of the big ones, Wiley Blackwell, Routledge, Springer, Pat Chong's SIRD, and then also local publishers. So, of course, they include Eureka. I was the in-house editor for Eureka for a couple of years, till I couldn't stand working with Salma anymore. Think City, Entrepot, and the first publication of Hikayat, the new kid on the block, so on. The subject areas that we're mainly dealing with in terms of the books that we've been editing for the aforementioned presses would be Southeast Asian studies, history, politics, cultural studies, development, heritage, arts, and so on. Although Helena's going to give an example where we went out of that particular comfort zone. Why? It happens that my own background was as an historian initially, both of Africa and Asia, and then later in politics and international political economy. So that kind of gives me an entree in terms of subject matter and subject knowledge into those areas. And that's going to be an important thing, and I think Ki Beng was mentioning it before. Here's how we see the process in which we start with the idea that all writers are bastards. So then we have to create, on the basis of that, a collaborative project. Oh yes, yes we do. But as Junior Baker, also another very eminent editor, said, it's editors who make books. It's editors who make books. Collaboration, this is very, very important because we are midwives, boosters, shrinks, you know. We play all these roles simultaneously. And it's very, very important, care is very important because, you know, writers have large egos and they get bruised very easily. Transparent and flexible. As long as they do it our way, we can be flexible. And then the last part of the collaborative project, yeah, in an ideal world, and as Helena's presentation will highlight, we don't live in an ideal world. The aim is to work in an ongoing relationship. Philip Roth, in some of his last novels, he would always dedicate them somewhere either in the frontispiece or at the end to his editor of 42 years. I mean, you know, a great, great, great writer who, you know, did the hat tip to the editor. That's an ongoing relationship, and it's often known that writers of esteem have editors that are in lifelong relationships. They're like marriages, you know, you go through their ups and downs, you threaten divorce, depends on what the severance payment is at the end of the divorce, but, you know, that's the ideal, and we don't have that opportunity very often, unfortunately, in a Malaysian context, as freelance editors. So those are my introductory comments. Even the jokes are deadly serious, believe me. Helena.
Yes, you're the clicker. Thank you, Gareth. So I'll just jump straight into the nitty-gritty. So I'll be largely speaking about the whole editorial process, from a more general to a more narrow, specific kind of editing. So the first stage is developmental editing, where we develop the goals of a project with the writer themselves. I got edited straight away. Cut. Yeah. So, as Gareth said, in an ideal world, this is where we come in at the editing stage. But unfortunately, most of the time, we come in at a much later stage where the writer, where the author has already got a full manuscript and they just send it off to us. Here, clean this up for me. Yeah. Bastards. Our job is to work with the initial concept, which may only consist of 2 to 3 pages of outlines that a writer will send to us, and we'll go back and forth in a collaborative sort of way to shape the manuscript, to give our advice of what their idea should look like in a book. At the next stage, we have a conversation with the writer about the content and the substance of the book, what would work best in the terms of flow. But we also look at what are the unique selling points of the book. This is where subject knowledge comes into play, knowing what other books are out there on the market, how this book would be different. And this is also very important to write a book that hasn't been written before, because the publisher also doesn't want to publish something that's already out there. What is different about your book that's not already out there?
And as Helena said, subject knowledge in that regard is really, really important. And I think we do bring to bear quite a lot of all-round knowledge within our region. And it's a huge shortcoming of many academic publishers that they have maybe competent copy editors and so on, but people who have little or no subject knowledge of the area. And this does store up problems, support problems for the author at any given time.
So, yeah, updating is a really big problem that we have with a lot of manuscripts, especially academics. They've got a deadline, they have to meet their KPI. Okay, I need to put out 1 book this year. But the manuscripts were written 2 or 3 years ago. And if you don't update, we guarantee you, your reader will know that you are a lazy writer. So we've had books where data has been 5 years ago, but statistics get updated every year. Writers need to be more proactive in updating. You need to keep things relevant. Gareth and I are working on a book right now that looks at Malaysian politics. one of the chapters doesn't even address the elections. There's no mention of it. So why should a publisher put out your book if it's old? They can find a writer who's more proactive, who's written something newer and fresh.
Just on that particular book, I just got an academic publisher in Malaysia, UK Impress. It's not just one chapter actually, Helena. About 3/4 of the chapter, we're still talking about Najib as the current Prime Minister. We're still talking about policies, for example, vis-à-vis China, like the one road, one belt policies and so on, as if it was still Najib, as if the whole 1MDB scandal had not yet opened up. And these were writers who were submitting chapters in July and August. Now, excuse me, there's still a couple of months of a window there where you could have revisited your chapter and actually addressed those issues. Malas is the word that comes to mind.
Yeah. So, what is the big problem with developmental editing is time. This kind of editing needs time, and more often than not, publishers or authors, they want to rush out a manuscript. They couldn't care less how it's done. They want it the next day, if possible. But they don't realize that this could take weeks. For a complex academic book, ideally, it would take a year of editing from beginning to end, but they have some kind of deadline that they want to meet, so it needs to be done now.
So could you imagine working for somebody like Minh Bui Jones? The shocking demands he places on us and so on. Now, my favorite story is always my dear, dear, dear friend and a good friend of many people here, Pak Chong. Pak Chong has a particular mantra. He thinks you can have anything, a meal or a book, it doesn't really matter, faster, cheaper, more delicious. And we say you can only ever have 2 of those 3 things. But he always wants all 3 of those things. So he wants delicious editing, so the books are great, you know. He wants it cheap, well, he gets us cheap. But he also wants it faster, you know. He's not part of the slow food movement. So it's a tough call. But this is developmental editing. We have had very little opportunity to actually engage at that level. One of the few people I have is Azhar Ibrahim, because that's an ongoing relationship. You know, we're working on 3rd and 4th manuscript together. You are having a conversation. This thing keeps cutting out, which is probably editing. And then the other subject, the other requirement?
In-depth subject knowledge, and this will come back again and again in the editing process, but especially in developmental editing, because you need to know what exactly the writer is talking about. And between Gareth and I, we cover most of the subject areas that Gareth has mentioned earlier. One example of this is a book that we worked on this year, a very big project for Springer called Anthropogenic Tropical Forests. This book looked at human-nature interactions in central Sarawak, and each chapter involved social scientists, it involved hard science, it looked at issues at a regional level, at a very local level, but also at a global level. And another reason that this was so complex is because most of the researchers were Japanese, and English is not their working language. So when you throw in all these technical terms and places most people have never heard of, it can get very difficult. And if you bring that subject knowledge with you, you can help the writer convey what it is they're trying to say in the best way possible.
So this book is a major, major project, the culmination of a 5-year research project from Kyoto University in Japan, the leading institution of Southeast Asian studies in Japan. Springer is a very reputable publishing house. So the book was science, was social science, was on Sarawak and non-native speakers and so on. The great chapter, tell them about the fish chapter.
It involved freshwater fish in plantation water, in freshwater streams, and we had to also edit more than 80 photos of fish.
We prepped the photos for publication. But look at this state-of-the-art team. You all know now that I've got a social science and humanities background and so on. So I fit half of the project. She's got a
Biomedical background.
And she comes from
Sarawak.
drum roll. So that was pretty cool. But the developmental editing, we hope and we do sometimes, we're able to help the author to get to this stage, which is very familiar to people like Hikayat. This is a book proposal for a very reputable academic publisher, happens to be Palgrave Macmillan. It's a real proposal. You can see it's 5 pages. It has to be very succinct. And all the developmental points that Helena just mentioned need to be contained in that form. But it includes, so what are the other books on the market in your field? Why is your book different from those? What are the so-called, to use their language, unique selling points of the book? And you know, academics are so unworldly, they're so blurred, they're just so whatever. So to be able to put together, they're trying to record me. So to be able to put together a proposal like this and to help an author, it's something we will do. But we don't often get that opportunity because often authors come to us when they've already passed this particular point in the game. Okay.
So the next stage in the editing process is substantive editing, where we still have a fairly general overview of the manuscript. And at this stage, we are keen on getting the writer to write or rewrite for readability and flow, something Kibang mentioned earlier. Does the manuscript read well? So deeper and substantive editing are all about moving towards a final manuscript where we can do more detailed editing. Here we still operate at a broad language level, analyzing the work in terms of coherence. With many books, what we get are standalone chapters, so we have to decide which chapters work best with which chapters. Does the chapter get repetitive if you put them together like this, or even which chapters to remove completely from the manuscript. We also get feedback from reviewers. It's normal for academic books to have peer review, so these comments should be taken into consideration. And then just creating a new draft of the manuscript. Again, time.
Yeah, something Min, can you make sure Min leaves this room like having read that slide several times? But here's something else. So last time it was subject knowledge, this time it's
structure and coherence.
And that's very much, I think, what Kibeng was referring to in terms of his approach. So Helena's asked me to illustrate this, and let's come very close to home with the illustrations. Perhaps not the first one. Let's talk about Zairil Johari. Let's do it. Zairil, I edited a book of his essays, Finding Malaysia. It came out at last year's Georgetown Literary Festival, so it's a year old. I have to say Zairil was an exemplary writer, so he's not one of the bastards, because we actually did take 8 or 9 months from the beginning to end. He came and sat like a good writer does, at my feet, I mean at my desk. And he came regularly every 2 to 3 weeks. Where he found that time to do that in his busy social life, difficult to tell. But here's the thing. He had collected, he's a prolific writer, he writes for the magazine, had for other columns and so on, over quite a long period of time. So what were some of the issues that obviously came up? Repetition. because these were standalone pieces that needed background and so on, but they were now between the same covers of a book. And there are a number of times, how many times do you want to hear about the background to the Allah issue, because there were 3 essays on it, each with 3 different takes, but still, we needed to cut out some of the repetition for the back. We presume the reader kind of read it once and understood it. Up to date, updating, as Helena said before, because he might write a piece on his visit to Turkey in 2014 and saying, Turkey, like Anwar Ibrahim, yeah, Turkey is wonderful, it's full of Turks. But since then, of course, a rather authoritarian backlash had taken place, and we worked very hard. He didn't want to diss Erdogan completely. He was taking a kind of Anwar Ibrahim line on it. But of course, he was more critical than he once might have been. So there were issues, and there were issues which had really gone out. They were no longer, so we cut. And very, very importantly, we worked with a big jigsaw puzzle to actually arrange the flow. Because you can have different concepts for organization. One could have been chronological. You simply, as they came out, you put them there, which gives you a sense of the development of the writer, but can give the reader a bit disorientated because you might be jumping from topic to topic. So we decided on a thematic approach, which is more difficult, actually, in some ways, but it clustered the essays together. Dina Zaman's book, oh, what a laugh that was. 35 standalone pieces, but we actually had to persuade her to write an anchor chapter. More than just an introduction, an anchor chapter that kind of allowed the reader a point of entry into understanding the entirety of the book, and then maybe honing in on 2 or 3 key themes. And it's funny, because she's a journalist by training, and a lot of journalists just think the piece goes out there, it stands there. Today's newspaper headlines, tomorrow's fish and chips paper, it doesn't matter. You know, they say today's the rooster, tomorrow's the feather duster. But here's a book, you stand by a book. You know, it has an afterlife, it has a readership. And so the shaping, especially of standalone books, books that comprise standalone articles, is kind of quite a tricky thing to be able to undertake. Now we're getting down to the dirty business.
Yeah. So the next stage is copy or line editing, which involves many things, but the most important part is figuring out what house style to use, and this is usually determined by the publisher. The big academic publishers have a very clear house style to follow. But unfortunately, a lot of writers, even though they know which publisher is publishing their work, don't even bother to look it up. So we get a manuscript that needs to be edited in a lot of ways. These house styles cover things like referencing, footnotes, and spelling. We like to use Oxford spelling, but academic presses in the US will obviously use American spelling. What can we do about it?
And Minh Bui Jones uses, guess what? Australian spelling. Did you even know there was Australian spelling? There's Australian spelling. They're funny because they sometimes follow the Brits, but like the Labour Party is L-A-B-O-R. Like suddenly they went all transatlantic. It's very odd. But you see, people like us, we need to know those things because, you know, Min will scold us otherwise. I mean, it's a terrible thing. The French have the l'Académie Française. It's written in stone. The Pantheon will decide. Germans have, you know, they being Germans, of course, you know. But English, oh my goodness. Oh my goodness, you know. And it's not, by the way, the big divide, yes, it's US, British, but within British. Helena says we use Oxford, but with one exception. We use ISE instead of IZE. You'll probably go, what? So globalization or globalization. For me, it's a kind of aesthetic, it's whatever. It's because the Guardian and the London Review of Books use S. So if it's good enough for the Guardian and the London Review of Books, it's good enough for us. But he uses focusing, double S. I know. Isn't that weird? Double S. I don't, it's really, every time he sends something to proofread, I want to take, and then I remember he's Australian. So we forgive him. The last sentence there is very important. You see, we copy, edit, and whatever, and I think Min's actually very, very good at this. You're still trying to preserve the original voice, and that's always, you know, the temptation is to say, oh, let's just rewrite this crap, you know. I mean, it's really not very good. And Paul Augustine sends me, you know, his pen picture of P. Ramley and whatever, and you want to, you know, I'd look at Helena and said, shall we do the business? And then we have to remember it's Paul, and he's written something very nice. And no, I'm joking a little bit, but it's a tricky, you know, where's the line? Where's the line? And I'll tell you a story later about completely rewriting for somebody. The ethics of it, who knows? Helena?
Yeah. Consistency. This is something that writers lack again and again and again. Asking them to be consistent between 2 chapters seems to be a lot. Asking them to be consistent within a chapter is almost impossible. We've had names misspelt at the beginning of a chapter and then correct at the end. It goes on and on and on.
What we love is one of the recent Mekong reviews, the reviewer of a book by a Singaporean writer, spelt her name wrongly all the way through the review, of the writer of the book who's under review. Enough said.
Again, clarity and sense. Does this make sense to a reader who has no subject knowledge? Does it make sense to someone who has a lot of subject knowledge? Does it flow right?
Yeah, this is going back to Ki Beng's thing of the reader. Now we're introducing the prospective reader in I guess you must think, God, these guys are saying the same things again and again. You can't tell a writer enough times. They're really bodo, they just don't care enough.
Yeah, so the errors and inconsistencies. One issue that we get a lot is a figure that's in a table, and then when the author talks about it in the text, it's completely different. One of the things Gareth first said to me when I started editing was, never trust the writer.
Correct.
And this has been proven true time and time again. Things like, when was the independence of Singapore? Wrong day of the month, wrong year. How?
In an academic book that passed a PhD at King's College London, because the external examiners did not have regional subject knowledge. I mean, for us, we didn't even have to look it up. Hey? Singapore left us in that day? No, cannot be, you know. Yeah. But the examiner was the most famous. I won't sell it.
Another issue is permissions, if any work's reproduced, if tables or figures are being used, images. This should all be done by the author, but again and again, as we say, writers are lazy. So they leave this for us, and unfortunately, it shouldn't be our job because it takes ages.
Luckily, Minh Bui Jones uses Wiki Commons, so he's in the clear. He's in the clear with his permissions. That's very good. Because people sue. People sue. And, you know, her 85 fish, remember the 85 fish? You know, luckily it was one Japanese scientist who sat there like, oh, I don't know, anally retentive, you know, snapping each fish with one of those little measuring things, you know, like they put the little ruler so you know that this fish is 84 centimeters long or whatever. That's fantastic. But then people steal stuff and they don't give permission. Kia Ken, I don't know, if people stolen your artwork and not used it, let them do it, then sue them. Our job, they think the editors, we're supposed to also get permissions from them, you know. Mind you, you know, these David Lowe photographs are all over the place that, you know, they're in the public domain, I believe, you know. Yeah.
Again, consistency. Why we're saying this again? Because writers aren't consistent.
Hammer the point. Ah, yeah, finally.
Yeah. So basically, copy or line editing is to clear out the manuscripts so that it can be sent for layout. And this has to be done in a way that the layout artist can understand. The layout artist is there in front of the computer with their layout software. They can't be second guessing, does this figure go here? Does it go later? Is this a subheading? Is this a title? So our job is to make that very, very clear for the layout artist to understand.
So with the 85 fish, which was chapter 22, so we go through the manuscript and highlight in yellow, figure 22.86 about here. Because we can't say exactly here because it depends on the layout. Figure 22.87 about here. We do all that crap. The author's sitting in their office in Kyoto University thinking, what am I having for dinner tonight? Sushi or ramen, you know? Fish! Yes, they're going to eat one of the 86 fish. And this is something, this is a good example, Helena, isn't it? This is kind of something we will do. Yeah? Okay, you tell us what happens at this stage.
At this stage, we send the writer the edited version of their manuscript without track changes, but with the comments or queries about references or issues that haven't been addressed. Sometimes the writer writes back, can you send me the one with the track changes? And then we do, and often the entire thing is highlighted much like this. So then we get back very quickly an email, oh, sorry, no need lah.
We decided to spare the blushes of any of our writers. That's not one of ours. This is a very typical file. It can still be covered in queries. If there are queries that we want the author to clarify, and often there'll be queries like what, Helena?
Missing references, points that haven't been elaborated on. Sometimes in the introduction, they'll bring up their hypothesis or their analysis, and then in the text, it's never reflected back on again.
So we don't send them the full, you know, with the grammar and the syntax and the spelling and what, we spare them that. And then they just have a heart attack if they insist on seeing it, and it's okay, we'll leave it, okay. We're nearly there, don't worry. And then?
So the final stage is proofreading. We get back the layout proofs from the layout artist, and we're very old school. It has to be on paper, because on a screen, you will just miss things. It's going to happen. So we compare the laid out proofs with the last version of the file that we've sent to the layout artist to see if they've gotten everything correct. Sometimes a page is missing, sometimes figures are missing, who knows?
Yeah, it's a small, funny thing. With modern typesetting software, it's a really odd thing. We send the manuscript in Word, and bolds, Roman is regular type, and italics are all in there. They don't automatically go in when the typesetter pours the text in. So she has to actually bold each one that's bold, and the worst one is italics. They have to actually find the italics. Luckily on the Word file you can see the italics fairly clearly, but I don't know why InDesign and all these guys can't just, so you just pour the text in and it keeps that formatting. So we have to double check all that kind of crap.
Another thing that we check for at proofreading is how the text sits on the page. And this is something that good proofreaders do. Is the kerning correct? Are the indents correct? Is the paragraph correct? Sometimes the layout artist has a lot to do. They're under a time constraint. Again, not enough time. They'll miss one or two things. Some readers might not catch it, but some readers will. If it's an academic book and you've spent a lot of money on it, you'll wonder, why did I spend so much money on this? They can't even get the layout right. So a good proofreader will make sure those errors are caught. Yep. So when we do proofreading on the page, one of the things we use are operational signs. This is, again, text. Is this italics? The indent's correct? And then we use typographical signs and punctuation marks, which are self-explanatory.
Let me talk a bit about this. So there is a universal language, an Esperanto, if you like, of proofreaders' marks. And they cross languages. And in this day and age, where your layout artist is not necessarily in the same city, the same island, the same country. I mean, the last Springer book was laid out in Bangalore in India. I've had books laid out in the United States, and we're working here. But in the old school way, I don't know if you do it, Julia, you should be able to do the proofreaders' marks, and they should be able to understand them as a universal thing. You hand over the proofs to them, she or he inserts them, and then you check the proofs once again, and you keep washing until you have a clean manuscript. What's the problem? Most Malaysian designers who design books have no clue what these signs mean. There's no training. So Hikayat is going to run a school, a class, and we're going to invite designers to actually come and learn this arcane knowledge. One reason they don't actually learn it is because if they're working online, we actually have to take those corrections and then we actually have to mark up the PDF with those. And then it becomes incumbent on us, and we're extremely careful. Change it, and the it will be in closed quotation marks, to it's in closed quote. Very, very, very precise. You're not asking the layout artist to think. You're asking her to follow a clear instruction, and it takes a long time. But we always mark up on paper first. So we mark it up on paper, and then if the designer is not down the road, if she's in Bangalore, we have to mark up the proofs. So we use Acrobat Pro, professional thing, but you can actually still do it on Reader, where you're actually putting in post-it notes. You've seen the post-it notes, or you've seen highlight text, and that's what we use. And that would be a proof in an electronic version, so the layout artist would actually see these little notes there, and they need to follow them very, very precisely. That would be a late proof, because if there's only 2 corrections on that page, we've washed it pretty thoroughly. Okay, we've washed it pretty thoroughly. We're there. We're almost there. And yay!
Last slide, so don't worry. Preparation for print. This is making sure that the layout artist has inserted all the corrections from the earlier proofreading, and we check the proofs against the earlier version just to make sure. Luckily, we've worked with layout artists who are extremely competent, and for an entire book, maybe they'll only miss 1 or 2.
But we have to find those 1 or 2. It's almost more difficult. If you know a proof is a bit dirty, you tend to think, okay, there's an error coming up on nearly every line. But what if there's 1 or 2 errors in 300 pages? Do we get lazy? We try not to. You know my technique? I read a line forwards, I read the same line backwards. I'm very, very good at backwards reading, believe me. It says something about my personality.
Catching anything that may have escaped, again, or inconsistencies. Sometimes the inconsistencies you don't realize are there. They crop up when you read the entirety of the book at once, in one sitting.
Yeah, this one is because we've often been comparing. We read against something else. You need to also read finally for itself. You read it as if you are the final reader, reading all the way through. And you're nearly at the end then, because you're really hoping that sense, consistency, flow, as well as all the technical things have been ironed out. And then the layer artist will send they're called final artwork files, so high res PDFs are usual in Malaysia, to the printer, and the printer in a day or two will send back a mock-up. This is a digital print, pasted back to back. It looks like the final book. I mean, of course, not at the same print quality, but it looks like the final book. And the proofreader and the designer are supposed to check. You're not now looking for errors and whatever, but you're looking for page runs and so on. So I once edited a book for a very esteemed press, and the printers forgot the last page of the index, so there was no X, Y, and Z. The trouble is, in a book on Malaysia, there are lots of X's, Y's, and Z's. It's not quite like English. And, you know, you're really grateful, the book's nearly done, you're getting to the end, oh, let's just turn it over. You have to go to that last page. And then you, of course, the final thing, you check the covers. You check whether the ISBN code bar works, you know, because you can. And we're almost there, or maybe we are there. Yay! We're signing off. Thank you very much. Remember the slide that talked about permissions, and it's all about copyright? So this is all our copyrighted material. So the people who are sitting sneakily in the back rows, taking photographs of all the slides, can you please hand in your phone cameras to Julia Tan, so for her to sanction you? Thank you. Minh, that's what we do, mate.
Well, can
Hello.
I just say for writers out there, don't be discouraged. we are here to make you look good. The different stages of production. It's sausage factory. You don't need to see all the blood and guts on the floor.
No, Minh speaks the truth. We are actually here to make you look good. Who's a writer here? Any writers in the room? I know Paulie. Oh yes, we have some here. Of course, Leela in the front here. There's a few writers. We're here to make you look good, Leela.
And you're not bastards.
They are. Until the book's gone to bed, they are.
One comment from me, especially when you said about drawing. Where do you draw the line on rewrites? I draw the line when the article has no voice. Actually, like you were saying, oh, how do we destroy that fella's voice, whatever. Sometimes we get articles that are just absolutely bland, even though the subject can be as interesting as, like, I don't know, walking on fire or something, and you get the writer who writes it like it's...
Have you made a decision to run the story? Yes. So what do? Do you rewrite for them? Do you make an assessment about whether the writer is even capable of finding that voice? What do you do? What do you do?
Well, I think you should never... I really don't rewrite people's stuff. I mean, I really like an author is a voice, and to rewrite it, I'm putting my voice in that person's mouth, and it's not right. The trick with, I'm at the very first stage of production, where I discuss with the writer about what we're going to do, and the art of editing there is to build up the atmosphere, to get them to goal them to create the right kind of spur for them to deliver the goods, and of course every writer is different, and the art of editing is to know your writer, to read everything as much as possible that they've written, know a lot about them, talk to them, and sometimes and knowing that background is very, very important, because you're able to coax them into that mood of delivering the stuff that you want.
I'll give you an example of a dilemma, and I'd quite like your response to this dilemma. So about 2 years ago for Springer, again, major international publisher, we did a book called Borneo Studies. What was very important about this book is it had senior writers and early career writers. It had writers of international renown, some of the greatest anthropologists of Borneo in the world, and it had quite a lot of local, younger authors from Borneo. Sarawak, as usual, very well represented. Sabah, middling. Brunei, at least there were a couple of voices. But very unusually, the book had 4 chapters from Kalimantan in English. Now, the reality is the quality of some of the writing, some of the expression in those chapters was relatively rudimentary. Let me put it that way, relatively basic. Now, as an editor, you can point this out and throw the manuscript back. And here's a young writer in Pontianak without many other support resources, language resources and whatever. But for political and for content reasons, you want the chapter in the book. Otherwise, it becomes another book about Borneo that's mainly about Sarawak. So what do? In the end, because you could just go on an endless ping-pong match by throwing it back, it's sent back to you very, very poorly. In fact, I'm working on a chapter right now that has a little bit of this. In the end, with Victor King, the lead named editor, and with the publisher, I asked if I could rewrite with the permission of the writer. Delicately, it's not my voice, I'm trying to echo his or her voice and whatever, but at the end of the day, the process of just sending really problematic text would have just held up the project. And I think a different type of editor or a different type of named editor or a different type of publisher would have said, cut the chapter. And that would have been, I think, would have undermined, done damage to the concept of the book, which was meant to look precisely at Borneo island-wide, and Kalimantan has a very important voice, and it's a very marginalized voice. Those are ethical dilemmas that you come across, and you declare them, but as long as it's transparent, it goes back to one of the first slides, I think what we did was ethical and acceptable, I believe, and for the greater good. Kibeng, have you come across those kind of dilemmas before in your work?
Well, I was just here thinking of something else, really, if I may go into that instead. I sort of sometimes think that the editor's work is somewhat paradoxical in that you're receiving a text from someone from a certain society. He gives you a text, and it's not exactly how he would talk, but that's how he writes, right? And then we, being anal people, sort of corrects it towards some standard, to be read by people from that same society who would probably have understood that writer anyway. But in writing, of course, there is that. You need to, it's an art. You have to, writing is an art compared to, a different type of art compared to oral conversations. But which leads me to think about, back to this post-colonial thing again, or the fact that we live in a society that's very multicultural, multilingual. We are very good at guessing what people mean. So we get into the habit of not having to be very exact in what we say. We rather prefer to be rather ambiguous about things. And yet, your listener understands you, apparently. And so that's how we use language. We're not that exacting. And that shows in writing as well, doesn't it? And so the editor's job is somehow to tighten and to sharpen and to sculpture, like the word you use, towards a standard that we have as academics or whatever it is. I wonder if sometimes we overdo it, you see. But of course, the printed word to us seems like a permanent thing. It's like a sculpture, it's a statue, and it can't stand there with mistakes on it. That kind of thing, right? But today with social media, a lot of words no longer seem to seek that permanence. So you don't even use words, you use emojis and whatnot, right? So communication with words seems to be getting rather blur. That's a point I thought I wanted.
Just to pick up on that, Ki Beng, I mean, the quality of language, okay, let's talk about this. It's not only people say that, social media and whatever has undermined the core quality of how we express ourselves and so on. It's not just that. In the academic world, the publish or perish mantra in which your departmental heads are demanding you publish, 3 so-called peer-reviewed articles a year and whatever, as opposed to the monograph, the book, that may take you 8 or 10 years to write, but that will last a generation or more. That's not what academic worlds want anymore. It doesn't meet KPIs. So what tends to happen is really a flattening out of very mundane reproduction, often very repetitive, because that's part of the game. I'm going to put the same article in 3 different places. We know all those shortcomings, and it's very, very sad. So that's one thing. And then I pity, and I'm sure you do, Ki Beng, if I had a 30-year-old protege, a student of mine, and so on, saying, I want to enter the academic world today, I would really, really counsel them into some of the horrors that they can expect. Because that great PhD thesis that took you 3 or 4 years to put together, you're going to have to slice it up, salami slice it up, because your head of department wants you to put out these very three, in order to help the department's standing and reputation, which then helps funding. It's a treadmill. You're a hamster on a treadmill, going round and round and round and round. So when are you going to get time? I mean, Helena kept talking about time, to sit down and revise that manuscript, which was once a PhD thesis with all its limitations, into a piece of writing that's going to stand the test of time. I disagree with something that somebody said before. The easiest writers I've ever worked with have been the greatest. And I think they're great because they're the easiest. Benedict Anderson, Anthony Reid, who engaged, who were responsive, who were funny, who were appreciative. It goes back to the Philip Roth thing, I stand by my editor. The most insecure, Malaysian, middle ranking, 30, 35, they've got their PhD from the University of Backwater, but they think they're somebody because they come back, they're so sombong in front of their students, but they can't write for toffee. Then, when I came to do my research in the mid-90s under Jomo, and I said, I've read this, I've read this, I've read this, I've read it. You don't need to read. You know what he told me to go and read? Pramudia. Go and read Pramudia's Buru Quartet. You'll learn more about a sense of feel and texture and place and smell from that, and he was absolutely right. Ben Anderson could draw on literary references, film references, popular cultural references, and it's not just these Western scholars. I remember my late mentor, Sharil Talib, or Wanzawawi Ibrahim, that generation, they're about 70s now. They had a hinterland, an intellectual, cultural hinterland, and an ease with language. And it didn't mean because they could do that in English, they could not also write in Malay. There was no either or there. It was just this broad, general hinterland. And you brought that sense of style. Bring a sense of style. What I like about Min's Mekong Review, you can be a super academic, but if you don't know how to write in a way that truly engages, that is really, really, then he's going to spike you, no matter who you are. Even Simon Winchester, I quite like that story. Those of you who don't know who Simon Winchester is, he was the Observer's correspondent, global correspondent, Guardian, for years and years and years. He's like a superstar in the firmament, but if he's lost the touch, he's lost the touch.
Thank you. We'll take questions from the floor. Does anyone have any questions? Perhaps I'll start. Yeah. So we all read for a living. it's words. So how do you read for pleasure anymore? I mean, to take a crass example would be gynecologists who see a certain part every day, and yet they have to go home and, so like for editors, how do we find pleasure in reading?
Who goes home and has difficulty in what? Say it.
Procreating. Reading.
That's a good question, Julia. I think one, maybe not the gynecologist part, but for me, and I think for Gareth as well, one way we still find pleasure in reading when we've spent the last 12 hours reading is to read something not only that's well written, but something that's a completely different topic. If you spend all day working on politics or academic books, pick up a good fiction book. That's the best way.
I think you've put your finger on it. Editors edit for editors. Editors reading pleasure. But yeah, there is a what do you call that? The downside to this kind of work, that you edit everything. You walk around, you see a road sign, and you say, why is that road sign not written some other way, right? But yeah, at that level, it does affect you. But then you do appreciate a good book much more, you know.
But it's contagious, Keeping, because, Bettina will come to me now saying, Go. There's a misspelling on page 87, halfway down the page. They missed it. This is fantastic. The contagion of editoriitis, something like that.
Thank you. Thanks, it's been very informative. My question is for newspaper editors. Do newspapers editors influence the way society's thinking forms? Because from what I get from you, you don't censor things. You just allow the writer's voice to surface. You might make it sharper, but what the writer writes essentially is still intact. But for newspaper editing, is it different? And are these people in positions of so-called power in that they determine what society reads or does not read?
Well, of course, that depends a lot on the paper, its bent, its values. Certainly, if you are a newspaper record, you report the news, whatever and whenever. Of course, the editorial pages are a different matter. When it comes to, say, for instance, when I was on the news desk quite a while ago, and commissioning pieces, op-ed pieces or feature pieces, of course you do. That's a human factor. I choose certain writers that I like, and their viewpoints resonate with mine. But nevertheless, you always the prime motivation is to serve the public, is to spread information and to broaden their perspective, and so. And also, of course, there's a third arm to that, a writer has to be able to convey his or her ideas. You've got to be able to be articulate and to drive home the points you're making. So you do influence, of course you do. You influence the society, and that's why you're in the business. You're drawn towards the cause, and whatever your beliefs are, you go into that business and you try to propagate those values. I think so.
Well, by default, I think editors are, of course, a filter. They do decide. They do have power. But we like to think that there's a whole range of it, right? But your point is about newspapers, traditional newspapers, I suppose. Yeah. Well, I was a journalist once, so I tend to be rather cynical about editors. news editors, right? They do have power, and they're closer to political ideologies or to commercial interests than we like to think. But today, my gripe about many newspapers is that they're too lenient. They let the worst side of society get more playroom than should be allowed sometimes. They tend to pander to our society's worst impulses nowadays and call it sensationalism or whatever, right? And perhaps the blogging culture was a way to try to break the centralized power of the newspapers, but in the process it might have gone the other way instead, where you get fake news. It's like just anything that comes to my head is worth reading, you know. So that line disappears between verified news and just anything that came to someone's head. And after a while, we lose our sense of our sense of guessing what could be true and what's not true, right? Too much pandering to it's gone that way instead. But I think with social media and whatnot, at the same time, I'm one of those who think that with Malaysia Baru and whatnot, that one of the things that we need to look at is to look at journalism itself, and that our top journalists and the editors should again revisit what the idea of being a journalist actually is. I think that line has been rubbed out quite seriously. I tend to think that newspapers should actually become more column-based instead of news-based, and that news should actually be slightly analytical to work against the power of the editor, perhaps.
Can I Pauline's supposed to go next, but we're friends. We appear on cover of magazines together, so I took the microphone for her. I'm just going to lighten the mood a bit, because the moment that you asked that question, I recall one of my very favorite television shows, which was Yes, Prime Minister, had an episode in which exactly the question you asked was raised. Nigel Hawthorne plays Sir Humphrey, who then says to the Prime Minister, the only way to understand the press is to remember that they pander to the reader's prejudices. And Jim Hacker, who plays the Prime Minister, says, don't tell me about the press. I know exactly who reads the papers. The Daily Mirror is read by the people who think they run the country. The Guardian is read by people who think they ought to run the country. The Times is read by the people who actually do run the country. The Daily Mail is read by the wives of the people who run the country. The Financial Times is read by people who own the country. The Morning Star is read by people who think the country ought to be run by another country. And the Daily Telegraph is read by the people who think it is. And Sir Humphrey says, well, Prime Minister, what about the people who read The Sun? And the assistant says, the Sun readers don't care who runs the country as long as she's got big tits. So, yes, the editors in Malaysia anyway, prior to Malaysia Baru, definitely, and I raised this in a session which Gareth moderated at the festival earlier, I worked for TV3 many years ago. I came into TV3 at a point where what had happened is a company called Renong had bought over the Fleet Group in Malaysia. Renong was the investment arm of UMNO in those days, and suddenly in the newsrooms, whether it was at New Straits Times or the Malay Mail or Berita Harian or any of the group under Fleet, we all found that we had additional layer of masters. And part of quite almost everything of what we did was colored by who we were owned.
I wanted to comment when Helena was talking about subject knowledge. Editors who have subject knowledge, it must be quite a rare thing in Malaysia, as I believe. And I wanted to say that it's the same thing that we encounter with translators. Translators need to have subject knowledge, and the sad reality is in this country there are very few translators, even from translating just from English to Malay and vice versa, who have literary knowledge. I mean, I don't know what ITBM has been doing for all these decades with that kind of funding, but we do not have, even in ITBM, enough people with literary knowledge to do, or literary sense, instinct, to really be able to translate works of literature into seamlessly or evocatively into another language. And much less even people who speak or learn foreign languages to the level and also with a kind of literary sense or subject knowledge that they can translate from those languages as well. But what have the universities been doing? What have these institutes like ITBM been doing in terms of educating editors, translators, and also writers?
Well, if you believe our mutual friend Muhammad Haji Saleh, they've been snoring, like Dewan Bahasa's been snoring, as he called it the other day. No, it's a real issue, Pauline. So USM, correct me if I'm wrong, Julia, does have a section or a department of translation studies. But the problem is, it's very narrowly defined. It's almost like technical level of translation and so on, okay? Which is all very well. In the commercial world, I guess you do need, to have 7 languages to operate the cell phone that has been put together and so on. That's fine. And in fact, that's some of the work you used to do. You used to edit kind of technical writing and so on. And actually, it's one of the reasons why Julia is actually a very fine-toothed editor, in my opinion, is that she had to do that very boring but very precise type of early work. It's a good apprenticeship, even though you're bored out of your skull. We just had the Georgetown Literary Festival. We've been instrumental, Pauline and I and Bettina, in putting translation work center stage. And how could it not be in Malaysia, obviously, or in our region? We had the great Asha Sata as the guest of honor for a standalone lecture. She's the Penguin Books translator of the Ramayana and has been for 30 years. She's a renowned scholar, interpreter, and translator. You could count the number of students who turned up that on the fingers of one amputated hand. There weren't any. At the festival itself, free. This is not Ubud, where you pay big top dollar to go. This is not Jaipur, where you pay top dollar to go. Is the gap between campus and the practitioners so great, just as the gap between Dewan Bahasa and the other institutions so great? But they won't come and have a dialogue, they won't come and have a talk, or they won't just come and sit at the knee of somebody like Asha or whatever. One of the few people who cross these boundaries is Prof. Muhammad Haji Saleh, who is able to work across these things. He's extremely frustrated, but Prof's getting on. Where's the next generation of translators who have the kind of intellectual hinterland that Pauline is speaking of? And I despair. Things are far, far better in other neighboring countries. Indonesia, for example. Taiwan, thanks to some very interesting initiatives. I don't know, Min, if any of Vietnam, Cambodia, or Laos, but certainly those 2 countries. So we have the infrastructure, we've had the budget, we're a relatively wealthy upper middle income country, but we have not invested in the minds. We've got fine buildings, they have publication budgets and so on, but the practitioners, shallow, time serving, political serving. We actually need a revolution when it comes to this kind of literary production work.
Thank you very much. Thank you everyone for coming.
Can I just add one thing? Just if you, just one thing I thought, if you're a writer and you've submitted something and if I mean, I work by instinct, so if I receive something and it's just perfect, and I would write back immediately and say, utterly brilliant it's in. If you don't hear back from me for 2 or 3 days, you know something's not right.
You did.
And you know some editor will quibble and try to criticize this part of your essay or say that. But the trick is, as a writer, is to ask the editor, what would you like me to convey? What would you like me to get across? And that editor would tell you, and then you'll be able to correct it or tailor it to that editor's request. And that's a better way of taking charge of the situation.
Any more questions?
We have a party to go to, but we're so nice, we'll stay and take more questions.
I'm not, I like to go.
He had 2 gin and tonics before coming here, and he's having withdrawal symptoms.
Yeah, actually, I mean, I understand most of the writings that you're talking about is like political, academic, because I write more for fiction, like based on true stories, and I just want to understand that is there like a different process, or when you go about, or when would be actually the right time for me to bring my book to the editor? Do I wait till I finish the entire manuscript, or no? I just want to understand the process because I'm really brand new in book writing. I've always just been writing articles or doing programs for company. So right now I'm actually going into writing a book, and I'm quite clueless.
Yeah, the answer to that query is, could you ask Wiki Beng, Dato Doctor, and Ms. Julia Tan to invite us back, and we'll do a whole new session on fiction editing, and maybe invite the great Pauline Fan to be on the stage and come and talk to us. Yes. It's a different process. I mean, that's not a flippant answer, yeah? But we just thought we'd focus on the hardcore stuff tonight.
I have a question for Gareth, talking about ethics of authorship. I am a retired researcher. Now, when I was writing papers, we were always told, don't put the name of your boss as your co-author unless he has contributed. And your Pontianak chapter, Gareth, you have rewritten the chapter so much. Don't you think your name should be there also as the co-author?
That's it's a really good question. On the Borneo Studies book, where there were 3 named editors, that means, the book comes out with its cover, and it's Victor King, and Zawawi Ibrahim, and Noor Hashrina. And Terry King, in his preface, actually wrote, Gareth, you should have been the 4th named editor in the front. Okay. Look, if I put my name to something, it goes through another set of layers. I descend into the 7th circle of hell. It has to go there. I won't put my name to something unless I feel... And so when I'm editing and helping to rewrite and whatever, it's still the voice of the original author. It's not necessarily my voice in there and so on. I mean, I used to write academic papers, which 6.7 people would read in a 5-star journal, which got me a promotion and whatever. That's bullshit. Now I write for people like Dr. Wee Chen Gi about photography. I write with Kia Kien on these amazing paintings he does and whatever. It's a different voice. And I just wish I'd done it 30 years ago instead of like being an old man and coming and doing it now. So authorship, I have no ego in that sense, And if I sit down and do co-author with somebody, which I have done, it's a project we begin together. We hold our hands all the way through to the project. We swim or we sink, and we hold our heads up high. And when Helena's grandchildren say, oh, you see that piece? It lasted the test of time. No, I wouldn't. I wouldn't. But you know, the ruthlessness of academics and so on. I used to work. I'm going to say names. I used to be senior research fellow at the Asia Europe Institute, which is University of Malaya, and I left. In fact, Wazir Jahan took my job. That was great. She came after me, and a new director came in who had not published anything since she'd done her PhD 20 years before, and suddenly a new vice chancellor came in and said, "Alamak, KPIs. You all have to publish." And this woman had no intention of actually doing any research and writing. So she went round and saying to all the research fellows, put my name on your paper first, put my name on your paper first. If not, I won't renew your contract. That's corruption as well, isn't it? It's not just 2.6 billion, that's corruption as well. And that was taking place in our so-called most esteemed university in Malaya. Not very long ago. So, it's a smelly pool. It's very stinky. You're lucky you're out of it.
Never went in.
Oh, he never went in, he says. That's true. You were always like on the margins, weren't you? Yeah. You were never a bona fide departmental guy. Yeah.
Let me make one final point for me tonight. Related to the revolution that we need in where the development of the mind is concerned. We relate, Malaysians anyway, we relate to writing in a very strange way. We don't mind talking, but when we write, it seems to be some kind of special project, right? So that when suddenly someone will say, oh, I'm going to write a book, and he's never written anything in his life, right? Well, that's why your editing work is difficult, right? I suppose if writing is seen more as an extension of just thinking, so you write just for your sake. You know, not every word you put down has to be published. Some bloggers you wish would stop blogging, of course, you know. Well, but I mean, surely like any other art, the more you write, the better you get. But we don't have this practice, or the way we conceive of writing is a bit warped, I think. In that you just sit down and start writing, but you've never written before. Of course, you're going to write crap. You know, but if
that's a technical term in editing circles. Crap.
Yeah, that's just a point I want to make, that we don't write enough. Writing as a way to help you think, basically.
I mean, sometimes you wonder what's going through people's head, and it's a kind of, maybe it's a wannabe culture. Maybe they swallowed it that, you know, being a published writer is very, very sexy, like Min, you know. I'm not going to reveal too much. This may be a little bit too sensitive, but somebody says, you know, I've written a novel. Good. Before we talk about, you know, tell me, who do you read, and you know, who your influences were. Well, I don't really read. Okay. So, like in the vision, this thing came out of the sky, just like entered my brain cells. And if the manuscript is twice as long as War and Peace, and makes the Red Chamber look like a sort of little giveaway, or the Ramayana as a little feuilleton, come on. There is inspiration, divine inspiration, but come on, there's also craft and time and a cultural pool from which you are invited to drink till you're sated. And do you have something to say? You know, there are a lot of trees out there that die hopelessly, don't they, Min? I mean, they just, you know, forests. So, my friend in the back, you can come and talk to us, but, you know, this thing that you want to write, you really need to write it, don't you? Just really, really, really need to write it. I'm glad to hear it. Come and talk to an editor.
If there are no more questions, all right, thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for coming.